All right, so thank you all for coming to another whimsical story about CMMC. I appreciate everyone's attendance. We're here today to talk about how to streamline your CMMC implementation. In other words, how do you reduce costs, how to reduce time in order to get to a point where you can become compliant to meet the CMMC standards. There's a lot to it, but I've got some amazing guests with me today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But some of the smartest people I know, Bob Stevens and Leia, are here today. And Bob, why don't you do a quick introduction of yourself?
Hi, everybody. This is Bob Stevens. I've been here with Bulletproof for about 6 years, both in service delivery, doing compliance consulting and audits. And happy to be here and share my knowledge with the CMMC standard and with today's topic.
And
And
Leia?
I'm Leia Shilobod. I am the founder of Compliancy IT. We are a security and compliance focused MSP outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, serving the entire country. I am a CISM and also a CCP. And I serve in the role of Chief Security Officer for my organization, and gave myself the moniker, the IT Princess of Power, because if we're going to do this stuff, we might as well have fun while we're doing it.
And I affectionately call her Princess Leia. So so what do we expect today? This is our agenda. So what is CMMC really? Why does it matter? Just a brief review. We believe that if you're on this webinar, that you are quite familiar with CMMC, but we'll just touch on it briefly. And then scoping versus scoping. How do you define the assets? It's a very important subject matter. In other words, where's your sensitive information? And then the importance of MSP compliance. And Leia is really an expert on this, and so she's going to speak to that deeply. And then how long does it really take? There's a lot of different conversations that are happening in the ecosystem about this. What is this? What is the time frame that you need to be looking at in order to make sure that you're eligible for contracts going forward under CMMC? And then so obviously the key takeaways, and then questions and answers. So we welcome you to type in questions in the chat at all times, but we'd like you to hold off on questions, live questions, until the end, where we'll do a live Q&A. Okay, so let's move into CMMC. Here we go, people. So why does it matter, and what is it? So this is just sort of a quick update. I'll run through this real briefly with all of us. It is intended, of course, to reduce the unauthorized disclosure of sensitive material. We're trying to protect the warfighter. We're also, by default, protecting the borders of our country. And there, as you all, I'm sure, are aware, 3 levels that we're working on. So level 1 is where you're working on protecting federal contract information. That's FCI. And then level 2 is where you are protecting controlled unclassified information, CUI. And then level three is the expert level, which is still being defined by the Department of Defense. But everyone in the world of contracting with the Department of Defense is going to have to meet these requirements at some level. So what we're here to do is talk about how do you get there as fast and efficiently as possible. So let's go to Bob and talk about scoping versus scoping.
Thanks, Darrin. And as Darrin said, there are multiple definitions of scope, some you're familiar with and some which may be new to you, and we're going to go into that today. So everybody's familiar with, as Darrin said, what's the scope of the project? We're building a building. The building's in scope. The airport next door, out of scope. We're all familiar with that definition of scope. And for those who are starting on the road to becoming compliant, you're likely working on a project plan to go from your current state to ready to do the certification assessment if you're going for level 2, and you know what that looks like. What is in addition to that would be what is in and out of scope for your compliance. So the example we use a lot in the practices within CMMC would be Wi-Fi. If you don't allow Wi-Fi, if you don't use Wi-Fi, that particular scope of protecting Wi-Fi or that practice may be out of scope. What we're really going to delve into today is that third meaning or definition of scope as it applies to CMMC, which is what is in and out of scope in terms of my FCI or CUI, the two types of information that the CMMC standard and compliance practice is meant to protect. And so what we are proposing here is that for some OSCs, organizations seeking certification, that early scoping, defining where your CUI is and which assets that resides on, will make the rest of the project, the rest of the scope of preparing for compliance go more easily, be more obvious to you, and actually compress the timeline to become compliant. And what we like to say is, you can't protect what you don't know you have. So that's really the topic today.
That's a great way to put it. And Leia, the next concept really are the assets. Do you want to address that for the audience?
Yeah. So, what Bob's talking about is really beginning with the end in mind, right? So in the end, we want to make sure that we are fulfilling our contractual obligations to protect FCI and CUI. And DoD provides us with a document. It's called the scoping guide. And so often I think we go right to the assessment guide and figure out how are we going to apply these controls. And we totally skip over that scoping guide that gives us some really good information that we need to look at first before we do even before we do a gap assessment, because we have to figure out what is it that we're supposed to be assessing here. So in the scoping guide, it gives us a great table here describing the different kinds of assets. And while we are going to talk more about the scope of those assets, like what kinds of things you need to think about for assets, it classifies for you what those assets are. So once you figure out all your assets, what are they? Are they a CUI asset? Do they process, store, transmit CUI? A security protection asset, a contract risk manager managed asset, or specialized asset? Or, like we talked about, are they completely out of scope? Why is that important? This table shows how you need to apply the controls to those assets, and also how to document them and how they're going to be assessed when you get to assessment. So if you don't start by doing that, then you could potentially spend a lot of time, energy, effort, and then and not get to where you want to, or actually make the process incredibly inefficient and change gears the whole time. So this is going to help you understand where to start so that the overall effort is streamlined.
That's brilliant. And so let's go into the assets.
Before we move on, the thing that I would mention is, remember, we're not just talking about information in digital form.
Right.
So you may well have CUI on paper that needs to be protected as well. So we'll get into that. But basically, we're talking first. The first category of assets would be CUI assets, and these are assets that can and do process, store, or transmit CUI. And of course, we're talking about FCI as well, but when we say CUI, that's in the context of CMMC level 2, but the same concepts are applicable for level 1. Processing would be information that is in the process state. So an example would be, you have an application open, like Excel or Word or email, and you are actively working with that information, perhaps editing it, producing it, etc. So that's the process, or that's sort of the process state of information, right?
Even viewing. even viewing is processing, right?
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. That's a great point. You open a document, it is read only. You're processing that information.
Oh, that's
Um,
fascinating.
yeah. And then, store. We're showing a thumb drive here, but obviously there are many different mechanisms and technologies for storing data. As I mentioned, it might be on a piece of paper in a file cabinet. It may be on a thumb drive. It may be on a hard drive on Sally's laptop in the office, and it may be stored in the cloud. These are all different technologies, but they are all representing information in the state where it is being stored.
And what about something like a printer, Bob?
That would be processing.
That
And
would be my
that
take as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
device is processing the information to spit out a hard copy drawing. So we don't have enough time to talk about printers today, because they are the bane of every IT person's existence, and also compliance bane as well. But that is also really, I mean, that's a good, morsel of information to leave for everyone to also not forget their printers.
I guess the one last thing I'd mention on storing information is that just keep in mind, and you probably are if you're in the process of developing your compliance, that there are actually storage requirements that are part of protecting the CUI. It's a bit nuanced, but for instance, monitoring information. You're required to define how long you're going to store that information, and you need to protect that information. Without getting too into the weeds, things like monitoring information stored and protected can actually, you leverage that to accomplish other practices, like yeah.
Separation of duties.
Separation of duties. Thank you very much. Just moving on briskly. We have transmit. So basically what we're talking about there is the information as it transits both things like a network. So as you're probably aware, you have to protect the CUI in transit. Most commonly, that means things like enabling encryption. We could go into FIPS 199 and the difference between being FIPS validated. That's a little deep for our conversation today. Just understand that CUI exists in different states, and it needs to be protected in all of those states. And something that was new for me when I really started digging into these practices is, let's talk backups. Let's talk CUI on physical media being transported to potentially offsite storage for folks that still use backups that are physically segregated and you use offsite storage. Moving those physical media, you have to protect that while it's being moved from your primary processing facility to the backup facility. That's considered CUI in transit as well.
That's actually a really great segue into the next group, security
People,
protection
technology, and
assets.
facility. Yeah. It's actually a
Yeah.
brilliant segue. Yeah. And you talked about this with me, Leia. You had mentioned that a lot of people get focused on the technology, but the people side of this is probably one of the more challenging elements, and a very important piece of the puzzle to be compliant.
Yeah, because many of the controls are really focused on technology. We see so many of them talk about technical, relating to technical controls, thinking about the information being digital. And so they think about the technology associated with the controls. The people and facility are also really key. So who are the people who are going to provide some protections? In this case, that with a backup, that person is in custody of encrypted CUI and taking that backup off-site. So they are acting in the role of security protection asset. an external services provider like an MSP or an MSSP, or a systems administrator, security manager, or even a security guard. All of those fall into people who are acting as a security protection asset. And then the facility. So what facilities are going to come in scope for the controls? You have to determine what areas of your facility are going to be controlled. The controlled areas where you're going to have CUI is what's going to be in scope. So for some organizations that have multiple locations, it might be a singular location.
Yep.
Or even if the contract is smaller, perhaps it is a smaller area inside of that facility. Here's an example. Um, there in almost every single business that I go and visit, there is some kind of a room, like a conference room, where they'll have visitors in and things of that nature. And that is physically separated and secured from a controlled area, like a shop floor or a lab or something like that. You can't go there unless you have some kind of device to get through that door, right? So that would be the controlled area, and this conference room area and this lobby is perhaps an uncontrolled area. And that does help you to decrease scope again, understanding in these areas is where we have to make sure we are applying controls. There's the control area, and then this is the uncontrolled area, and getting that clarity right at the beginning. So what people are involved with securing the information in hard copy format and in digital format, what is the technology that you need to use for storing CUI, processing CUI, including those printers, and transmitting CUI? And then what facility or parts of a facility are in scope?
Yeah, thanks, Darrin. I always think back to AT controls or the practices, right? And I think that's a great example of how your scoping affects what you have to implement, right?
Mhm.
Which people work with CUI, and if you don't define that, you're training everybody. And if you do define that, you may be training a small subset of your total staff. And in larger organizations, that can become a very significant difference.
So speaking of people, we're going to move on to contractor risk managed assets, which it was actually, Leia, you mentioned something to me the other day about this concept of capable versus intended.
Mhm.
And I would love for you to extrapolate on that.
Yeah, so a contractor risk managed asset, that is going to be an asset that's capable of processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, but it's not intended to do that. So, uh, and that could be the policies that you have in place, procedures you have in place. It's typically not a technical control because most of the time, if you have a technical control in place, it would actually logically separate that device or and then not allow that um, to actually process, store, transmit CUI. So think about the things in your business that the intent is not to process, store, transmit CUI, but what technical assets do you have that potentially could? And the reason why you see in that table a couple slides back that you still need to apply the controls there, but they are not going to be an active part of a CMMC assessment. The assessor is actually supposed to either spot check or just make sure the documentation looks proper, that you have applied the controls. Why would you need to apply the controls if it's not intended to process, store, transmit CUI? Well, because there is that capability. So if you make a mistake, which happens, we're humans, we make mistakes all day long. If you make a mistake and that CUI ends up on a system that's not supposed to process, store, transmit CUI, our federal government wants to make sure that it's still protected. And that's the reason why you need to apply those controls, but they're going to be not actively assessed in the same way that the CUI assets and the SPA assets are going to be assessed during your official CMMC assessment.
And so, and Leia, I mean, can you've actually shared this with me before in the past, but where is the strangest, well, not strangest perhaps, but maybe a surprising place where you find when you're working with your clients, where you find some controlled unclassified information where you wouldn't necessarily believe it should be there?
The downloads folder.
Yeah, downloads folder. Yeah.
Yeah, the downloads folder. Yeah, because like some of my clients I'm working with, like they like their flow of CUI, their process is that they will log into their customer's secure portal, or perhaps maybe it's DoD safe, maybe it's a Primes portal, and they download the CUI, and they're supposed to save it to a different location internally, whether it's a server, cloud service, or whatever it happens to be. Well, during that process of downloading it, it ends up in the downloads folder unless there's some
Mhm.
kind of technical control in place to disallow that, and people forget about it. So I've got salespeople who have a bunch of CUI in their downloads folder on a local computer, don't realize it because they're not like, no, people are not going and checking that typically.
Right.
Yeah, so yes, so because that happens a lot,
Mhm.
we want to make sure that those computers or devices are also secured because of the mistakes that we make.
Yeah, it's interesting. We hear that a lot in the market where the sales teams and then that have the information don't realize it, and it may just be in the effort to win a contract,
Mhm.
and so they're sending information back and forth, and then it just sits there and it's idle, but it's not protected.
Mhm.
Um,
And
so
Darren, if I could, I
yeah,
one quick
please.
comment before we move on from this topic.
Yeah.
We're talking about early scoping, right? So
Right.
note that it says capable of, but not intended to, right?
Hmm.
How could you make it so that they are not capable of? Things like flow control, segmentation. Well, as Darren mentioned, the three of us talk quite a bit, and we talk about small to mid-sized companies with flat networks. So in the scoping phase, early on, you have this potentially opportunity to decide to re-architect your network. Now,
Mhm.
we're not advocating for doing that or not doing that. We're advocating for thinking about it early
Yes.
on.
Mhm.
Because if you don't, there's a lot of protective controls you're going to have to put in place for these assets that if they are segmented and excluded in a single protective technology, like they're in a different subnet and you can demonstrate that they can't process, store, or transmit CUI, then you don't have to worry about potentially several other protective controls if they're in the category of CRMAs.
Okay,
Excellent point.
excellent. Yeah, that's a really good point. So we've got two other elements here regarding assets, specialized assets, excuse me, and then out of scope assets. So let's talk about specialized assets.
Included in that are things like government property. That could be test equipment potentially. That could also be government issued laptops. If the government gives it to you, you're responsible for physically securing it, but you're not responsible for the controls. They don't want you going into that device and, changing a lot of things. It doesn't belong to you. And the things like IoT or some operational technology, some of those things are just not capable of applying the controls because they just have
Oh,
so many limitations on those
oh, that's
devices.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah, so we have to make sure that first of all, we're identifying what of those devices are going to, be involved in the process of creating a product or service, and then make sure that they are part of the asset inventory. Are they absolutely needed to deliver this product or service? And then if they are, don't forget about them and recognize they need to go on that asset inventory, and you need to apply as many controls as you possibly can. So certainly you can physically secure them, right?
mhm.
That should definitely be a control, and anything else that you're able to do that the device is capable of. So we still have to figure out how to treat those devices, not just forget about them, because they are involved in creating and the whatever the output of the contract is, but you think about them in a special way.
Okay, and so then we can take a deep breath and go to out of scope assets because now we don't have to worry about them, correct?
Well, as far as your CMMC and your control implementation and the CMMC assessment, that's true. And it's really important that's not to say, of course, that organizations should not be concerned about security or compliance outside of the scope, but we have, a timeline right now to get our organizations ready and to get these assessments so that we can continue to operate. And that's why we're all here is talking about like how do we decrease our effort as much as possible? So what in your organization can you actually take out of scope? What can you prove without a shadow of a doubt? This person, this facility, this technology, this is completely separated. It's not capable of processing, storing, or transmitting CUI in any way because it's physically separate, like a separate facility, or locked away, or logically separated in the digital world. And if you are able to demonstrate that, then those assets can be considered out of scope. You do not have to, you're not required to apply all these controls. It will not be part of your assessment. And we know that assessments are going to be time and materials. So the wider your scope, the more complex, that drives the cost up. The smaller scope, more simple, then that will drive the cost down. When I was trained on my CCP, I had some fantastic trainers. And this was the first time that I was exposed to this idea of having a CMMC asset diagram. I love the color coding because it really clarifies what are all of the things that are inside of scope? What are the things that we clearly are having outside of scope? It's visual, and the visual representation gives us something more concrete than just looking at a spreadsheet that has a list of all sorts of assets that are named and categorized that way. And then understanding that scope helps us understand how to properly apply the controls, and what is outside of scope for applying the controls, which then we can clarify the way that this information is flowing in throughout and out of the organization in both hard copy format and digital format.
I've seen both within CMMC and with other NIST-based standards that incorporate an SSP. This is right up front. This is section A of the SSP, so that now your SSP reads as this is what we're protecting, and then the practices and controls are how we're protecting it.
Yep.
Okay, so the system security plan is essentially framed here, guardrailed appropriately for an assessment or a self-attestation. And I think what's interesting here also is that it talks about the external service provider, which is we're going to lead into beautifully into really your wheelhouse, Leia. So we talk about this flow diagram that you've said everyone should have, and I'd like you to talk to that if you don't mind.
Yeah, this is like really, really important. Continuing on a good visual to help you understand how the information is flowing in your organization. This is to kind of sort of verify as you are building this scope out, where are we getting the CUI from? Like who is giving us CUI? How do we get it into the organization? Secure portal, email, is it being hand delivered? And then who's authorized to receive it? Because that person and that process is going to end up in scope in some way, right? And then when it's in the organization, how is it being processed? Are you creating CUI? Where is it being stored digitally? And then who's authorized to access that in hard copy and digital format? And then outflow. are you allowed to outflow it? Or, no, this doesn't go out, but it stays here. And the only thing that goes out is the end product or service. If it goes out, how do we send it out? How are we allowed to send it out? Who's allowed to actually make that decision? And then by mapping that out, and this is a super, super, watered down diagram that anybody could do, right? Anyone, anywhere could just do this really quickly, and then clarify, do we get everything in our scope? Back to the other slide, if you see that, I always go like this with my flow diagrams. Is everything, every component that we described here as we're thinking about our process, is it all captured in that diagram? Or what is the opportunity for us to be able to limit the scope, maybe pull information into a single location so that it's not everywhere? Do we need to send it out? Do we not need to send it out? How can we rely potentially on our own, our suppliers or our customers to provide some of these things for us, so that we don't have as many elements that we are responsible for? So your MSP, if they have access to your environment, then they are going to be part of the scope of your assessment. They are an external services provider. They are providing services in the category of security protection asset. That also means that they're going to be helping you to prepare evidence, and being right beside you throughout the course of that assessment. You need to figure out where they are in scope, because this is an external organization. You have less control. You need that clarity. Every single MSP should be providing you with a shared responsibility matrix. And that shared responsibility matrix should detail down to the assessment objective level, not just like that top level control, but down to the AO level. What things are they responsible for, and what things are you responsible for, and where do you actually share responsibility in this objective? The one that I say a lot, because this is very clear, your MSP, they're managing your environment. They are responsible for assuring that only authorized persons have access to that digital system, whatever it is, your server, Microsoft 365, whatever it is. But you're responsible for verifying who those people are and the access they're supposed to have, because they don't know. They need that information from you. They can't do their job on that unless you direct them. So this clarifies what it is that they need from you and what you should expect from them. If the shared responsibility matrix is not detailed, it's not clear, you haven't agreed upon it, there's absolutely 100% going to be confusion and surprises when you get to assessment.
And Bob, you can inherit particular controls, but it's still the responsibility of the OSC, correct?
Exactly. You can delegate the administration of the rights, but as Leia says, ultimately you as the OSC you know that who your users are and what information they should and should not have access to. So while you may delegate, you will likely have at least some shared responsibility for most of the practices.
Oh. So your MSP, acting in that role of a security protection asset, is typically going to provide you with additional third-party tools that are also security protection assets. Things perhaps like a SIM tool, also like an endpoint protection, backups, all those different kinds of things. And even then, it is very, very important that that is noted, and that you recognize that that even those third-party security protection assets, endpoint protection, SIM tool, they're also going to be in scope for making sure that they are compliant. So both the MSP, very clear in the proposed rule, they're going to need to be certified at the same level as you. So if you have a level 2 requirement, they need to get certified at level 2. If they have a level 3 requirement, then they have to be certified level 3. But
Mhm.
those tools also need to be certified at that same level, or they need to be FedRAMP. So, which is not FedRAMP is not required if they're not processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, but they're also going to have to make sure that those tools, whoever owns those tools, are applying the controls and getting certified. So just for everybody, whether you are purchasing your own tools right now, your own security protection assets, or you're getting it through an MSP or an MSSP, be prepared to potentially have some changes. Like that's just the nature of where we are right now. That
Okay.
as everyone's doing due diligence on these products and services, you might need to change your MSP. You might need to change, or your MSP might say, we have to change the SIM tool. We have to change this endpoint protection because we've talked to the vendor and they're like, CMMC is nice, but I'm out. Yeah. So to be prepared for those kinds of changes, don't be surprised. Because they have to go through the same thing that you're going through right now. And most of the people I'm assuming on this call have been in the thick of it for some time. It is not an easy process. You do not press a button and everything's compliant. So they should be preparing for assessment right now as well. And
Right.
if they're not, then that's a red flag.
Yeah, oh, yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's a red flag for sure. So,
And Darren,
yeah,
before
yes,
we
Bob,
move
please.
on, just one quick point that you actually brought up, that Leigh and I can kind of expand on is this idea of inherited controls. So what
Mhm.
we mean by that is if the MSP is providing you a tool or service to protect the CUI, they will actually provide you some verbiage on the description of how that works. And
Mhm.
then you can use that in your SSP. That is the short
I see.
version of what we mean by inherited control.
Yeah. And again, inherited, not abdicated. You still have to do
Yes,
that due diligence. You still
Exactly.
are the risk owner.
it's still the
So
responsibility of the OSC.
100%.
Yeah.
So now that we're talking about like we're blowing wide open scope right now with MSPs, could you think to yourself, this is a great thing to do. I can offload a lot of this stuff to the MSP. Now we're thinking, maybe there are ways to limit the scope of the MSP and perhaps limit my risk. So I have a couple of ideas here that might help you to limit the scope so that your provider would not have to get certified. You can think about restricting their access to your level 1 scope only. So oftentimes in organizations, if you have CUI, you go straight to level 2 controls and you just think about the CUI. But sometimes FCI um, exists outside of your level 2 scope, outside of your CUI scope. And that still has to be protected with those 17 controls in level 1. But your MSP can still be in that scope to support level 1. You can also consider training your in-house teams on controls and how to manage the CUI environment and assets so that an MSP or an external service provider does not have to do that. You could configure and deploy self-hosted and self-managed security protection assets like endpoint protection, vulnerability scanning, patch management, etc., so that you don't have to worry about the provider being
In
certified.
scope, right?
Yeah. But the important thing here is also this should be a very well thought out decision because there is a lot of skill, training, continuous education that is required in order to achieve this. And your organization may or may not have the resources internally to be able to actually limit the scope this way.
Right.
So
And I think
yeah,
that's a really important point, Leia, is the continuous maintenance of an environment like this is probably overlooked by a lot of organizations. So you just get certified and you're good. No,
yeah.
it's a continuous management process as well as a risk management process, because your business is at risk for losing contracts if you're not capable of doing this effectively. So I think you I know can speak to this very deeply.
I mean, like Darren, I've been doing this for years. I mean,
Hmm.
I started implementing controls for 800-171 before CMMC was even a thing back in 2016. And
Hmm.
I'm still learning and clarifying
Hmm.
and with the entire program, not just the controls themselves, understanding the
Hmm.
program, understanding all of those source documents and how they're related. I unless I had a robust in-house team that was doing that continuous education, I think that the risk might be too great to just do
Right.
everything in-house, but it should certainly be considered. So time is not on our side. Our the CMMC rule, actually, many of us were thinking end of November to the end of December for that to go final. And now that timeline has moved up a month or two, projected. That's what we're hearing,
Hmm.
which surprised a lot of people because everything has seemed like it's taking a long time. Now it's suddenly here, right? And it we this call, I'm really hoping, has illustrated that that it's so important to begin with the end in mind with this and to do that deep work and thought ahead of time. Because when you see on the screen 6 to 18 months, you don't understand maybe that in order to achieve anywhere close to that 6 month time frame, you have to start with scope, decrease it as much as possible, have a really, really, really good plan in order to achieve 6 months. When your scope is larger and there are more changes that you're going to have to make, more places you're going to have to apply the controls, then you're definitely looking at that higher end of 18 months.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've had clients talk to me, Bob and Leia, that have said that they've been trying to figure out where their assets are for 18 months, literally struggling for a year and a half, trying to find where's my sensitive information and who has access to that and what systems are they on. So just that can be overwhelming. So I think that what you said is incredibly salient, and that is just let's focus first on what do I have to go protect,
Mm-hmm.
and let's just
Mm-hmm.
drill there, and then
Yeah.
we'll go attack that with a plan to meet the NIST requirement, the NIST standard, and the CMMC requirements.
Yeah. I worked on a grant project with an organization, and we were supposed to do an entire gap assessment, and we spent almost all of the grant funds just on trying to figure out what the CUI was and figure out the flow and the scope because it was so difficult for them to try to determine what is it that's CUI or what is it that we are going to treat as CUI. But I think,
Mhm.
Bob, didn't you have an idea if you to use some technical magic there to aid in that if it's possible?
Oh yeah,
Yes,
to identify material. Yeah, yeah. Go
yeah,
ahead, Bob.
that's great. Great segue. So we've been talking a lot about this last slide, and we would say time is your greatest asset. It's also your most precious asset, right? And also remember that when Leigh is talking about implementing CMMC, that's not the same as sitting for the certification assessment, in which you need to demonstrate you're doing the practices. So you don't want to walk into the certification assessment with the ink still wet on your processes and
Yeah.
procedures. You need to be able to demonstrate that they're implemented, that you're operating them, and you've generated some evidence of compliance that you're actually doing that. But back to the point that Darrin asked about is yes, scoping, and I guess what we would refer to it as inventory, like doing an inventory of your information and
Mhm.
finding the CUI and identifying which assets that CUI resides on that's the precursor to can I consolidate it, right? Because that's sort of the theme here is if we can consolidate that, that may actually reduce and the scope, which may reduce your timeline. And yes, there are some tools. Um, there's Microsoft tools, part of I believe it's Microsoft Purview. There's
Yeah,
information
that's correct. Yeah.
identification.
Mhm.
And there are other tools on the market, and we very much recommend that for larger organizations with sprawling information, that starting with a very well-scoped inventory process and project.
Mhm.
You potentially leveraging a third party that does that for a living will absolutely help expedite that part, which, as we've been talking about, we feel is the precursor to really scoping the project of becoming compliant.
So time is not on our side.
Yeah, so in summary, it's really understanding where those documents are, leveraging technology where you can to identify marked documents, as well as understanding the workflow within your organization, the people, the processes, and the facilities where they may exist,
Yes.
and then putting the guardrails around them to meet the NIST controls. And that's essentially what we're talking about today, which is
Mhm.
let's get that figured out first, and then we'll go protect it, and then we'll get to
Mhm.
compliance in a much more rapid way and hopefully for a lot less cost. So, what are the key takeaways from this call?
Well, I think that the most important thing is that you, you know, you certainly need to have a gap assessment done, whether you do it yourself or whether you engage a third party, because you
Right.
have to understand. Well, first of all, you need a POAM. You need that plan of action and
Mhm.
milestones where you are out of sync with the controls. But if you don't start with scope, so if you just say, if you're just frustrated or anxious or just, confused, and you just come in and just assess everything. And so you pay an organization to do that gap assessment, and you have a POAM of the whole thing, right? The idea is not just to have this list of stuff so that you can say, well, I have a POAM. You're supposed to leverage that list to create projects in order to remediate, right? So if you don't start with that clear scope at the beginning and trying to be strategic to limit it as much as possible, and then you pay an organization to do a gap assessment, even if it's a really good assessment, how valuable is that going to be for you to make decisions and create projects if
Brilliant point.
later you're trying to decrease the scope,
Yeah,
right?
brilliant. Well, I think some of the key takeaways I would say is that we don't want to assume that all your data is CUI.
Yeah,
Right. And then there's one last concept I'd like you both to address. There's the concept of an enclave, and sometimes an enclave makes sense, and sometimes it doesn't work.
that's
Right.
true.
So maybe we can talk about that real briefly.
Yeah. So first, for folks that aren't familiar with the term, a term you may be familiar with in the practices is a system boundary. And an enclave and a system boundary are essentially synonymous. It's what's in scope and what's out of scope. And it's also the controls that create that barrier between in scope and out of scope.
Mhm.
Leia?
So I mean, I don't know about you, but I've heard a lot of, and there are a lot of products out there right now and a lot of services saying, we're going to make CMMC really easy for you. We're just going to give you this enclave, and this enclave is going to be, we'll be responsible for all the controls in there. Easy peasy, you're done with CMMC. Well, first of all, that is bad marketing because it's not
It is
true.
terrible. Yeah, I
Um,
know.
but um, but also, like, you should do the due diligence of understanding your business process to see if the enclave will work for you or if it won't. I've seen enclaves deployed, and it was the right solution. It made so much sense for the organization. It decreased their scope. They had a provider that they really helped them with the controls in that environment. But I've also seen situations where a provider comes in and they're trying to sell their solution, but they're not thinking about the business process. And so they forced a contractor into that solution. It did not work with their business process. Now their business process is broken. Now they're like, I don't even know how to function in here. I actually think that, we made a mistake. And those solutions are not cheap. And moving all your data there is not cheap.
Mm.
And then they're thinking, like, what do I do now? And I'm running out of time. So, back to beginning with the end of my in mind by going through that process of what is the scope now? How do we decrease the scope? What's the business process that we need to fulfill this? Like, going along systematically so that you make the right decisions, put your resources in the right place, and then overall make this as effective, efficient, and cost less.
That's brilliant. What a great way to end it. And I just want to thank everyone for joining, and thank you, Bob and Leia. So we are offering a opportunity to have an IT security and compliance services consultation at no cost. If you'd like to help have us help you understand, what your current state is and what your future state is, as Leia pointed out and Bob pointed out perfectly, let's look at the end game and start looking at what that looks like, and then figure out what the beginning is. And we can help do that, and we can do that at no cost. And so we'll be providing information for you guys to all have that available to you. And again, thank you all, and thank you, Bob, and thank you, Leia.
It's my pleasure.
And with that.